Wyoming Territory, late August, 1879. The wind came down off the bighorns sharp as a blade, and by the time the sun dropped behind the hills, the girl was shivering in the corner of her third barn that week. Hollis Whitlow pulled her coat tighter, the wool stiff with dust and travel. Her boots were soaked from crossing a shallow creek that morning, her knees scraped from slipping on loose shale 2 days before. The barn smelled of hay, old manure, and rusted tools. The cow that had been there last was long gone, but the flies had stayed. She sat up straighter, listening. The horses in the stall across from her shifted. One gave a soft snort. Something outside crunched boots on dry grass. Her heartbeat picked up. The door creaked open. A tall man stepped inside, backlit by lantern light from the house. He paused when he saw her, hand resting on the butt of his revolver. His hat cast his face in shadow, but she saw the tension in his shoulders. "I am not stealing," Hollis said, voice rough from dust and too many silent days. "Just sleeping." His hand stayed where it was. "You alone?" She nodded. "You hurt?" "No," he hesitated, then stepped forward into the barn. "You got a name," Hollis Whitlow. "And where you headed, Miss Whitlow?" She looked down at her hands. "Anywhere that will not send me back." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he tipped his hat back, revealing a face tanned by sun and lined by wind. His green eyes flicked toward the hay pile she was curled against, then back to her face. "You slept in 3 barns this week?" he asked quietly. She blinked, surprised. "Yes," the corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "This time you'll sleep inside." She stared at him. He held out a hand. "My name is Waylen Sutter. I own this place." She did not take his hand right away. "And what do you want in return?" His jaw tightened. "Nothing. Men do not usually offer shelter for nothing. I am not most men." His voice was calm. "You can sleep in the spare room. You can lock the door if it helps." Her fingers trembled, but she stood. "All right." The house was simple, a low-built homestead with timber walls and a porch that creaked underfoot. Inside, it was warm, smelled like coffee and old books, smoke and saddle oil. She walked slowly, taking it in. The parlor held a rough-hewn table, a bookshelf with no order to it, and a rifle propped beside the door. He motioned her down the hallway. "That door's yours. Fresh linens. There's water in the basin. You need anything else, just knock." She nodded. Waylen gave her one last look, then turned away. She closed the door behind her with a soft click. The room was small but clean. A real bed, white quilt folded back. Her throat tightened. She had not seen a real bed in weeks. She sat down slowly, her hands still shaking. In the morning, she found a plate of cornbread and eggs waiting on the kitchen table. Waylen was outside, splitting wood. She watched him through the window, arms moving steady and sure. There was a quiet rhythm to him, like a man who had learned to survive in silence. She stepped out onto the porch. "Thank you for the room and the food." He looked up, wiped sweat from his brow with his sleeve. "You heading out today?" She hesitated. "I do not have anywhere else to go." He studied her. "Then stay until you do." Hollis squinted against the sun. "You do not even know me." "I know what it looks like when someone's running." She dropped her gaze. Waylen set down the axe. "You working to keep moving or just surviving?" Her voice was quiet. "Surviving," he nodded. "You can help around the place if you want." There's always something needs mending, so she stayed. By the 3rd day, she had washed every dish in the house. On the 4th, she sorted the shelves in the barn. On the 6th, she helped him bury a fence post, her hands blistered but proud. They hardly spoke, but each day, he left her food without asking. She left his tools in better shape than before. She learned to read his silences and his small nods, and he learned the shape of her fear, how she flinched when a door slammed, or how her breath quickened when boots sounded behind her. One afternoon, as she was brushing down one of the horses, Waylen walked into the stall beside her. "You ride?" She nodded. "My father was a horse trainer." He handed her the reins. "Then take her out. She needs the stretch." She mounted without thinking, body remembering more than she realized. The wind in her hair made her feel like someone else for a while, someone not hunted by memory or men. That night, as they sat on the porch, she looked over at him. The stars were out and the cicadas hummed in the grass. "Why did you help me, Waylen?" He leaned back against the post. "Because someone helped me once, when I needed it more than I wanted to admit." She looked at him, really looked. "How long ago was that?" 10 years. A man named Tom Whitlow pulled me off a battlefield and got me breathing again. Her blood went cold. Tom Whitlow. That was my father. Waylen turned to her, eyes narrowing. You are Tom's girl, she nodded slowly. He died 3 winters back. Waylen let out a breath like he had been holding it a long time. He saved my life. She watched his face, saw the grief in his eyes. He talked about the war sometimes, said it made men ghosts. Waylen said nothing. She reached out and touched his arm. You are not a ghost. He looked at her hand on him, then at her. You do not have to keep saving people, she said. You already saved me. He did not speak, but something in his face softened. She felt it as sure as the wind on her cheek. That night, when she lay in bed, she could not sleep. She thought of his voice in the dark, the way he had stood between her and the world without asking for anything in return. And for the first time in a long while, she felt safe. She was not sure what that meant yet, but she knew it had started with the sound of boots in a barn. And the words, "You'll sleep inside." The days settled into a rhythm shaped by quiet hours and the slow patience of labor. Hollis rose before dawn now, without prompting, her feet already reaching for the floor before the rooster called. She carried water from the well before the sun had finished climbing the ridge. Waylen never asked her to do it. He simply nodded when she did one morning. As she wrung out her damp hair behind the house, he walked up from the field with a coil of wire slung over his shoulder. You ever patched fence? She shook her head. He handed her a pair of gloves without a word, then turned toward the west pasture. She followed. The fencing ran low along a dry ravine, sagging and split in places. Waylen crouched and pointed with a gloved finger. Cattle'll nose through if they see weakness. You don't get ahead of it, they wander. She knelt beside him. Seems like everything in this country's got to be held together with wire. He gave a low sound, almost a laugh. That's about the truth of it. The work was slow, the sun hot. Her palms blistered beneath the gloves, but she didn't stop. Waylen showed her how to twist the wire without snapping it, how to brace with a rock when the post leaned. He moved with economy, never wasting a step. She tried to match his pace, though her hands ached long before noon. When they paused under a cottonwood, he passed her the tin canteen. She drank, then looked out across the pasture. Do you ever leave the ranch? Went into town last month for salt and a new stirrup. Before that, not much. She wiped her brow. You don't get lonely. He took the canteen back, drank, then capped it. There's peace in being still. She nodded, though her mind wandered to the places she'd passed through, towns where no one looked you in the eye, where men sized you up like meat at market. Stillness had a different kind of weight here. That evening, as she stripped off her boots by the porch, he came around the side of the house carrying a wooden crate. Figured if you're going to keep staying, you might want space for your things. She stared at the crate. Inside were folded cotton dresses, a pair of worn but clean shoes, and a comb with a missing tooth. How did you? I asked Miss Elner at the mission school, said you might need some things that fit. Hollis swallowed hard, surprised by the burn behind her eyes. You didn't have to. I know. She looked up at him. Thank you. He nodded once, then turned back toward the barn. That night, she sat on the porch long after the house went quiet. The moon rose over the ridge in a sliver, casting pale light across the yard. Something in her had begun to shift, not with force, but like thaw after a long freeze. She didn't know what to name it yet, only that it sat in her chest like a slow, steady beat. The next afternoon, as they cleared brush behind the shed, she asked the question that had been circling her thoughts for days. Did you ever think of marrying? Waylen leaned on the shovel handle. Once. She waited. Her name was Me, lived across the river when I first bought this place. Her daddy didn't think much of a man with 1 horse and a half-broke barn. Did you love her? I did. She left for Cheyenne with a banker's son, sent a letter once, didn't read it. Hollis studied him. You think she regrets it? He glanced at her, eyes unreadable. Maybe. Doesn't change anything. She didn't push further. They worked until the sun dipped behind the trees, and when they came back to the house, she cooked cornmeal biscuits while he carved kindling. They didn't speak much, but the quiet between them had changed. It felt less like space and more like understanding. Later, she stood in the doorway of the kitchen, drying her hands on her skirt. I'd like to stay through winter, if that's all right. Waylen looked up from his seat near the hearth. His gaze held steady on hers. You can stay as long as you want, Hollis. She nodded once and turned toward the hallway, but before she reached her room, she looked back. "I'm not running anymore." He didn't answer, but the look in his eyes told her he already knew. The first frost came in early October, dusting the roof with white before the sun chased it off. Holly stood at the window, watching the slow curl of Wayland's breath as he led the mule team toward the lower field. Steam rose from their flanks where sweat met cold, and the wagon creaked under the weight of split pine. She pulled on her shawl and stepped outside. The wind bit sharper now, and the air held that stillness that only came before snow. Wayland looked up as she crossed the yard, then passed her the reins without a word. She climbed up beside him, boots knocking against the wagon's side. "I can take the back road if you want," he said, voice low. "It leads through the cottonwoods." "Less wind." "I want to see the open stretch," she answered. "Haven't since the summer." He nodded once, and they turned onto the trail that cut east over the rise. For a long while they rode without speaking. The mule's hooves thudded against the hardening earth, the cart wheels catching occasionally on frost-stiff grass. "I used to think Wyoming was empty," she said after a time, "but it's not, it's just wide." Wayland adjusted his gloves. "That's what makes it dangerous. You can get turned around thinking there's nothing out there and miss what's right in front of you." She tilted her head toward him. "You ever get turned around?" He kept his eyes forward. "Once." They crossed a dry wash, the bones of a cow half buried in the sage at the edge. She watched the ribs pass by, bleached and broken. "Do you miss who you were before the war?" His jaw moved, slow and deliberate. "That man never came back." She didn't press him. The wind carried a hawk's cry overhead, and the hills rolled out ahead of them, brown and gold beneath a pale sky. When they reached the far fence line, Wayland set the brake and stepped down. Hollis followed, brushing her skirts clear of the axle. He pulled a coil of rope and a rusted hammer from the wagon bed, then handed her a sack of nails. "Top rails snapped clean," he said, motioning to the far post. "Must have been the elk last week." They worked side by side, her holding the board steady while he drove the nails. The sound echoed, sharp against the cold air. Her fingers went numb, but she didn't stop until the last board held firm. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked, watching him wind the rope back into a coil. "I did. After the first year, thought I'd ride south, maybe cross into Colorado, start over." "What stopped you?" He looked at her then, brow furrowed against the light. "Didn't want to start over. Just wanted something worth staying for." She didn't respond, but her throat tightened by the time they turned the wagon homeward. The sun was dipping low. Shadows stretched long across the grass, and the mule's pace slowed with the weight of the wood. Hollis leaned back against the seat, watching the sky shift from blue to rose. "You think the land forgets?" she asked suddenly. He turned his head toward her. "Forget what? All the blood in it, all the loss." Wayland's eyes narrowed. "No. It just holds it quiet." They didn't speak again until the house came into view, windows glowing faintly with firelight. He stopped the wagon beside the barn and reached for the brake. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded. "I'll cook." Inside, she set beans to boil while he brought in the smaller logs for the stove. She didn't have to ask any more where things belonged. Her hands moved without thought, slicing salt pork, setting plates. When he sat down, she poured coffee into the tin mugs and passed him one. As they ate, he watched her across the table. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked. She set her fork down. "I used to be afraid to. And now, I'm not sure, but I know I don't want to keep moving." He studied her face for a long time. "You don't have to." The warmth in her chest bloomed slow and steady. She reached for her cup, fingers brushing his where it rested on the table. He didn't move. "Do you want me to stay?" she asked. "I do." She stood then, quiet as a breath, and came around the table. He rose with her, not hurried, not uncertain. She placed her hand on his chest, just above the place where his shirt hung open at the collar. "I'm not the same girl who showed up in your barn." His voice was low. "And I'm not the same man who found her there." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything they hadn't said, everything they'd built in the days between. She stepped closer. He wrapped his arms around her, careful but sure. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, but inside the fire burned steady. The snow came early, a hushing sort of storm. It buried the hilltops overnight, left the barn roof bowed, and softened the world into silence. Holly stood in the doorway with a wool blanket around her shoulders, watching Waylen drive stakes into the woodpile to keep the tarp from blowing off. He turned when he felt her eyes on him. Cold came down fast. She nodded, then stepped back to let the door shut behind her. The kettle was beginning to whistle on the stove, and the smell of boiled chicory filled the room. She poured 2 tin mugs and set them on the table. When Waylen came in, snow on his coat and boots, he didn't speak, just hung his hat on the peg and leaned over the basin to wash. His hands, cracked and red, moved slow under the water. She watched the way his shoulders rose and fell, the quiet way he existed in the space. There was steadiness in it, and she'd come to count on it more than she let herself say. "You ever think about building on?" she asked as he sat down and took the mug. He tilted his head. "To the house, to the land, a second cabin maybe, a smokehouse." Waylen considered that. "I've thought about a lean-to for the tack." This place was never meant for more than one man. She smiled faintly, wrapping her hands around her cup. "It's not just one man now." He didn't answer, but the corner of his mouth lifted just slightly. Then he looked out the window where the flakes were still falling. "You ever see Chicago?" he asked. "No, my father did when he was young, said it was too loud, too fast." Waylen sipped his chicory. "I passed through once. After the war, couldn't sleep the whole time I was there." "What's it like?" "Stone and smoke, no sky." Hollis leaned back in her chair. "I think I'd wither in a place like that." "You wouldn't." He looked at her then, steady. "You'd find a way to bloom anyway." She glanced down, color rising in her cheeks. He always said things like that plainly, as if they didn't carry weight, but they did, and she carried every word. Later that afternoon, she pulled her shawl tight and walked out toward the north field, where the old barn leaned against the wind. The snow had gathered in the corners, drifted halfway up the slats. Inside, she found the pile of hay where she'd first curled up weeks ago, back when her hands still shook and she didn't know what tomorrow meant. She stood there a long time, the cold working its way into her boots, until she heard the quiet crunch of footsteps behind her. "You looking for something?" Waylen's voice was soft. "No, just remembering." He stepped beside her, his breath visible in the dim light. "You were a ghost that first night. I'm not anymore," he nodded. "No, you're not." She reached out and touched the old lantern on the wall, its glass blackened from years of soot. "This barn was the first place I felt safe since my father died." Waylen looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Not because of the barn," she added. "Because of what you said." He was quiet a moment. "I meant it, Hollis, I still do." She turned to face him fully. "I know." The wind sighed through the slats, and a crow called somewhere in the trees beyond the pasture. "You think this is what your father wanted for you?" he asked. "I don't know." Her voice caught, but she kept her gaze on his. "He wanted me to live. I think he'd be glad I found someone who sees me." Waylen's jaw shifted. "I see you." She stepped closer, the hay crackling underfoot. Her hand reached for his, rough and warm, even in the cold. He didn't pull away. "I don't want to leave come spring," she said. "You don't have to. I want to stay because I choose it, not out of fear. I wouldn't want it any other way." They stood there, hands joined, the cold forgotten. The barn groaned softly above them, but the wind stayed outside. Everything that had once kept her moving was behind her now. What stood in front of her was solid, rooted deep as the cottonwoods out back. She leaned in, not rushed, and rested her forehead against his. "I'm yours, Waylen Sutter, if you'll have me." His hands rose, firm at her waist. "I've been waiting for you to say that." Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside the barn, everything held warm and still. By late November, the light settled different lower, golden, and weary by mid-afternoon. Hollis had started wearing her father's old coat when she went out to feed the chickens. The sleeves rolled twice and still too long. The fields lay quiet under a crust of thin snow, and the creek behind the house had begun to freeze along its edges. Waylen had been building something in the shed for nearly a week now, and each time she passed, he gave her a look that said, "Don't ask yet." She didn't. Instead, she busied herself with the root cellar, sorting what was still good, discarding anything soft or shriveled. She'd never had a cellar of her own before. Never had a place where putting up food meant staying. One morning, as she pulled jars from the shelf, she heard hammering stop, then boots in the doorway. "I need your help," Waylen said, brushing sawdust off his sleeves. Will I ruin the surprise? He stepped aside, motioning her to follow. You'll finish it. Inside the shed, the air smelled of pine and cold iron. Against the far wall stood a cradle rough built and strong, its corners hand-planed smooth. A single quilt square lay folded inside, edges stitched in uneven lines. Holly stared at it, her hands, still cold from handling potatoes, curled around her apron. You made this. I figured if we're staying, we ought to make room for what's coming. She looked up sharply. You mean, I want to marry you, Hollis, proper, and I want children with your eyes and your fire. I want you here not because you've got nowhere to go, but because this is where you belong. She stepped toward him, voice quiet. You're sure? I've been sure since the day you mended my fence without asking. She let out a breath that felt like it had been caught in her chest for years. Then yes. I'll marry you. They stood there a long time, just looking at one another, the shed dim around them and the cradle between them like a promise made of wood and open sky. They married before the new year, in the parlor, with Miss Elna from the mission school reading from a worn Bible. Waylen shaved for the first time in weeks. Hollis wore a dress the color of faded cornflowers, one she found in the bottom of a trunk in the loft. It smelled of cedar and a life half-lived. She made it hers. No guests beyond Elna and a neighbor boy who helped with the cattle when snow pressed too deep. They shared a meal after salt pork, potatoes, and biscuits fresh from their stove. It was simple, and it was enough. That night, Waylen took her hand as they stood in the doorway, watching the stars blink into being. You ever regret staying? He asked. She leaned into him. I regret not finding you sooner. He kissed her then, slow and certain, and the warmth of it lit through her like spring creeping under the door after a long winter. They built a life together the way they'd built everything else, with care and quiet strength. Hollis planted herbs by the kitchen window come April. Waylen fashioned shelves for her books, lining them along the far wall with room to grow. She taught him how to read the finer lines of a horse's gait. He taught her how to track deer through new snow. By autumn, she carried their child. Her steps slowed, and Waylen took to doing the heavier work without making a fuss or drawing attention. He left her apples peeled and warmed by the hearth. She mended his shirts in the rocking chair by the fire. One evening, as she sat with her feet propped on a stool, watching the fire dance, she turned to him. You think he'll have your calm? Waylen glanced up from the blade he was oiling. I've been dreaming of a boy, he smiled, soft at the edges. Then maybe he'll have your fire and we'll both be in trouble. Their son came in early winter, red-faced and wailing, lungs strong. Waylen held him with both arms, as if afraid to breathe too hard. Hollis, exhausted and flushed, watched the two of them with wonder stitched into every line of her face. They named him Thomas for her father, and set the cradle beside the bed where the fire could reach. Years passed, each one gentler than the last. The ranch grew slowly. Another henhouse, a second mule, a smokehouse built exactly where Hollis had said it ought to go. She taught Thomas to read by the same window where she'd once stood afraid to hope. Waylen taught him to ride by feel and to respect the land like it carried memory. They aged together without noticing, until one day the mirror showed lines where laughter had been, and her hands bore the grace of use and love. One fall evening, they stood on the porch, older now, wrapped in the same quiet that had always held them. Thomas had gone to town to help with a neighbor's harvest, and the wind brought with it the scent of pine smoke and frost. Hollis leaned into Waylen's side, her head on his shoulder. I was never meant for drifting, she said. You never drifted, he answered. You just needed the right shore. And in that moment, with dusk closing in and the land stretching wide before them, they knew they had made something lasting. Something rooted in care and choice, in the quiet labor of love, and they were home.